You're listening to episode 220 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Science philosopher Massimo Pigliucci joins us to speak about his experiences with Stoicism, and we discuss some similarities with secular Buddhism. Hi, everyone. Before we get started with today's podcast, I want to remind the listeners that we've started a new podcast which may also interest you. It's called Present Moment, Mindfulness Practice and Science, and appears every other week, alternating with The Secular Buddhist. You'll find many of the same guests you've enjoyed and learned from here, as well as new researchers, teachers, and practitioners. You'll find Present Moment in the Science and Medicine section of iTunes, in Natural Sciences, or just do an iTunes store search for mindfulness and look in the results in the podcast section. You can also visit the website, presentmomentmindfulness.com. Thanks for checking it out, and if you like what you hear, feel free to share it with others. We Buddhists sometimes think we're the only ones who had an understanding that our actions and the conditions of our lives come from our minds. Us secular Buddhists might even be a bit more smug about how we're the ones doing it right, because we're the only ones who do it in a way that's the most accessible and with the least supernatural belief. But, as it turns out, there are other very similar ways of living our lives that come from entirely different times and cultures than the entirely different time and culture from which our practices are rooted. Massimo Pigliucci has a doctorate in genetics from the University of Ferrara, Italy, a PhD in evolutionary biology from the University of Connecticut, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Tennessee. He has done postdoctoral research in evolutionary ecology at Brown University and is currently K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at City College and Professor of Philosophy at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His research interests include philosophy of biology, in particular the structure and foundations of evolutionary theory, the relationship between science and philosophy, and the nature of pseudoscience. Massimo has been elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science for Fundamental Studies of Genotype by Environmental Interactions and for Public Defense of Evolutionary Biology from Pseudoscientific Attack. In the area of public outreach, Massimo has published in national magazines such as Skeptic, Skeptical Inquirer, Philosophy Now, and The Philosopher's Magazine, among others. He has also been elected a Fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. Massimo edits and contributes to the online magazine Scientia Salon and co-hosts Rationally Speaking podcast. At last count, Massimo has published 136 technical papers in science and philosophy. He is also the author or editor of 10 technical and public outreach books, including Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk, Answers for Aristotle, How Science and Philosophy Can Lead Us to a More Meaningful Life, and Philosophy of Pseudoscience, Reconsidering the Demarcation Problem with Martin Baudry. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Bellini. Our guest today is Massimo Pigliucci. Massimo, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
I'm very glad you're here because your in a couple of worlds that we don't typically see a connection to. And before we get into that, I'm wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about your background.
Well, I started my academic career originally as an evolutionary biologist and pursued research in what biologists call gene-environment interactions, and the rest of us call nature-nurture issues. I did that for a couple of decades, a little more than that, and then I had my midlife crisis and decided that it was time to do something else. And rather than buying an expensive sport car that I couldn't possibly afford anyway, I went back to graduate school and I got my PhD in philosophy, which was a long-standing interest of mine anyway. And over a period of a few years, I was able to actually entirely shift my career. So now I'm professor of philosophy at City College in New York.
Great. And that New York change, that's relatively recent in the past year or two, correct?
The City College, it is, yes. I've actually taught at another CUNY college before, Lehman College, for the 5 years before that. But yes, I've been at City only literally a semester.
The next time you go through a midlife crisis, I solved the expense of a new car thing by getting a motorcycle instead, so there's another option for you. Well, what I wanted us to chat about, and as I had mentioned before we started, I am guilty of this as well, is seeing science and philosophy as two different fields, and there is an ocean between them. There's not really a connection. And you've described that quite eloquently elsewhere, the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe podcast, your own podcast efforts. Tell us a bit about the relationship between those two. How do they relate?
Well, it's an interesting question. So first of all, one could think of it in an historical sense. And if you go back far enough in history, of course, there's no difference between science and philosophy. What today we call science used to be called natural philosophy in the 16th and 17th century. Galileo, Newton, and Descartes all thought of them as themselves as natural philosophers, even though now we think of Descartes as a philosopher and Newton and Galileo as scientists. In fact, the word scientist didn't exist until the middle part of the 19th century. It was coined by William Whewell, who was in fact a philosopher and mentor to Charles Darwin. Of course, if you go even further back down, let's say Aristotle, he would have just not understood even what we mean by a difference between the two, right? So he was doing physics, biology, metaphysics, and ethics regardless. Now, of course, we live in a century where academics need to be specialized in order to have a successful career, because, of course, we're coming to a place where both science and philosophy have been active for a long time. So in order to make your contribution, if it has to be a novel contribution, it would probably be very specialized in a very sort of narrow subset of issues. That specialization, which has marked all of the academy throughout the 20th century, especially after World War II, has, of course, led to an increased separation of these disciplines, so much so that pretty much a lot of what goes on in philosophy today has little or nothing to do with science and vice versa. Now, to some extent, that's a natural state of affairs, and it's it's an understandable thing. And in fact, it's not even a bad thing necessarily. But it does tend to create this false impression, I think, that the two disciplines are, in fact, completely independent of each other. They're not. You cannot do much philosophy if you're not tethered to the best factual knowledge about the world that we have, and that factual knowledge comes from science. Vice versa, you cannot really do science, especially deep theoretical and speculative science, if you don't take on board a certain number of philosophical assumptions. I would even dare say metaphysical assumptions, not to mention, of course, a lot of epistemological assumptions, things, about how we actually know things. So the two are actually much more interconnected than people think, than even, I would say, many philosophers and many scientists think. Think of it as, in terms of sort of an analogy, mathematics and science are in fact quite different. I mean, often you do hear scientists, especially physicists, talking about mathematics as if it were a branch of science, but it's not. Most of mathematics has absolutely nothing to do with the real world or with understanding the world, the physical world as we know it. It is very sophisticated, very on its own thing. It sets its own agenda, and lots of what mathematicians do every day has very little to do with physics, biology, or anything like that. But you wouldn't go and say, oh, well, yes, but they have nothing to do with each other, because we all know that mathematics can be, in fact, highly relevant to the pursuit of science, much less so the other way around. It's not like scientists produce a lot of stuff that help mathematicians, but even that actually does happen, especially when we're talking about theoretical physics. So similarly, I see the relationship between philosophy and science. There is a significant degree of independence, but there is also a lot of overlap and a lot of crosstalk. The only difference between the two cases is that while mathematicians and scientists have no problem relating to each other, most of the times at least, philosophers and scientists are just not on the same wavelength very often. They tend to be either ignorant and or dismissive of each other's efforts, and that's an unfortunate state of affairs, which I've pushed back against over the last few years when I got interested in philosophy at a professional level.
And you're also interested in Stoicism, and I was wondering if you could give us non-philosophers a high-level overview, how that's related to and maybe distinguished from Neo-Stoicism.
Sure. So Stoicism is an ancient Greek-Roman philosophy. It started out around the year 300 BCE. It was established as a school in Athens by Zeno, Zeno Citium, not to be confused with Zeno of the Paradoxes. That one was much earlier. So it started out as a very practical philosophy. It started out as one of a number of philosophies that were grounded in so-called virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is an approach to ethics that basically says that what is most important in life is the development of one's character, that a good life is equivalent to a life of a moral virtue, essentially. So virtue ethicists include people like Aristotle, for sure, but also the Epicureans, the Stoics, and a number of other schools at that time. So it was a very, very much a practical philosophy focused mostly on ethics and on everyday practices. They had meditations. They had what we will call today spiritual exercises, all in the service of improving one's life and achieving one's happiness in the specific ancient Greek-Roman sense of happiness. They use the word eudaimonia, which literally means actually having a good demon by your side, but essentially meant a virtuous life, a life of moral virtue. So for the ancient Greeks, happiness was equivalent to having a life, a moral life, living a moral life. Now, Stoicism then was exported from Greece to Rome. It became very popular in the Roman Republic and then eventually in the Roman Empire. Some of the major figures of Stoicism that we know of today, and we still have a lot of the writings, are Seneca, who was an advisor to the Emperor Nero, Epictetus, who was a slave, who was freed and established his own school, and then finally Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor, who wrote something called the Meditations, which were really essentially a personal diary of his reflections about Stoicism and life. Now, after that, Stoicism pretty much died in the sense that with the end of the Roman Empire, it was a lot of its ideas got incorporated into Christianity. In fact, Epictetus' manual, he wrote something called a handbook or a manual on how to do Stoicism. His handbook was actually required reading for monks during the Middle Ages for a long time. And a lot of the early Christian writers were either absorbing or reacting against some of the Stoic doctrines. And so little by little, sort of a lot of the precepts of Stoicism got altered and or absorbed into Christianity. But Stoicism as an independent philosophy essentially ceased to exist in the first few centuries of the Common Era. And incidentally, we may talk about this later, but this is a major difference between Stoicism and Buddhism. You know, Buddhism has been practiced continuously. Therefore, it has a much more complex history because, of course, schools multiplied and people went all over in very different directions. That is not the case for Stoicism. There were different schools and there are different periods of Stoicism. But of course, the thing is much more limited in time and therefore much more limited also in terms of it's easier to understand, I suppose, or to get a grasp on because the number of texts is smaller and the number of doctrines is much more focused and sharply defined. Now, throughout the centuries then, there were occasional people who thought of themselves as Stoics or as they were clearly very influenced by Stoics. I mentioned Descartes before, René Descartes. He was actually absorbed a lot of Stoicism in his philosophy, in his moral philosophy. Michel de Montaigne, for instance, was another self-professed Stoic. The Earl of Shaftesbury was a Stoic. And then we get to the 20th century, and particularly after World War II. And now we begin with what we today is referred to as modern Stoicism or Neo-Stoicism. And that's an interesting movement in and of itself, which I'm still exploring, and it's going to be interesting to see where it's going, because it faces, of course, certain challenges, right? On the one hand, it's not, as I mentioned a minute ago, there's no continuous tradition of Stoicism. So to come up with something of a neo-Stoic philosophy, on the one hand, one can only rely on only a certain number of centuries, like 5 centuries of writings, basically in ancient times. But on the other hand, that also allows people much more of a free way of sort of redefining things, because well, there's been an intermission of almost 2,000 years here, so let's see what we can come up with that still maintains the original insights to a degree that it's possible and meaningful to talk about Stoicism, and yet we can update it to the 20th and 21st century. Interestingly, by the way, the resurgence of Stoicism in modern times is rooted into the origin of certain kind of psychotherapies, particularly logotherapy and Viktor Frankl, especially, and cognitive behavioral therapy and variations thereof. Those schools were clearly and explicitly influenced by Stoicism. Of course, psychotherapy is not a type of philosophy, it's just a type of practice that tends to be useful in specific settings, particularly in clinical settings, of course. Stoicism, on the other hand, is much broader. It's a philosophy of life. It's a philosophy of ethics. But nonetheless, one of the main reasons there's been so much interest in Stoicism recently is because those cognitive behavioral therapies and similar psychotherapeutic approaches are actually among the few types of psychotherapy that do well when scrutinized from a point of view of sort of evidence-based practice. They really do seem to work. They really do seem to alter people's behaviors for the better.
We're seeing the same thing in mindfulness practices, whether it's MBSR, mindful-based stress reduction, or for anxiety, for depression. There's increasing good indications that this can be helpful.
Exactly. Yeah, there are some parallels there as well. Again, you can take just the practice and forget about the rest of the philosophy, if you will, or you can take, like in my case, I'm more interested actually in the overall picture provided by Stoicism. But yes, some people just take certain aspect because it works for them, and that's all they're interested in.
Now, interestingly, in your paper on Stoicism, the very basics, which I'll be linking on this episode page for folks who are listening, so you can take a look at it yourself, the spiritual practices that are listed there, and you've mentioned them in your blogs before, will have some similarity to the people who are listening to this who are Buddhists and have that practice. I'm wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about what some of those spiritual practices are.
Sure, I can give you an example of the subset that I practice on a regular basis, although there are other exercises. If your listeners are interested, they can download actually a manual for modern Stoicism from the Stoicism Today website, which is based at, it's produced by a group of scholars and researchers at the University of Exeter in England, which is currently essentially the major center for Stoicism that I know of.
And interestingly, they're also one of the 3 universities that has developed the mindfulness-based intervention teacher assessment criteria.
That is interesting, yeah. So, typically what I do on a day-to-day basis is the following. So I get up in the morning and I look for a quiet corner of my apartment here in New York. And believe me, even though it's New York and the apartments are small, you can find.
But it's just the one corner.
That's right. It's just one corner, but you can find it. And you do the morning meditation. The morning meditation can include a number of things. In my case, what I settled on eventually was this. First of all, I try to rehearse and visualize the day ahead, particularly focusing on whatever I think might be challenging moments at, whatever level, at work or in personal relations or whatever. And then you try to remind to focus on which of the cardinal virtues you might be called to exercise in order to deal with those situations. The Stoics recognize, like lots of other Greek schools, and in fact later on the Christians, they recognize 4 fundamental virtues, and these are courage, justice, self-control, and sort of what they call practical wisdom, phronesis. So you do that, and it's a way to prepare yourself basically to the day, right? To sort of say, okay, here's what I'm going to be dealing with today, and here is how I plan on doing it. Then you do something that it's called the Hierocles Circle. This is a visualization exercise named after Hierocles, who was one of the Roman Stoics. And the idea is basically to visualize an expanding circle of concern, of ethical concern. You start with yourself, not because you're more important than anybody else, but just because it's you. And then you go on and say, you start visualizing. This is actually a visualization exercise. You don't just list names in your mind. You're actually trying to think about the people. So you start with your immediate family and the people that you normally would be concerned with anyway, your spouse or partner, your daughter or son or whatever. And then you expand visually and mentally to your close friends, and then to people that you might know less well, and then to your entire polis, to your city, and then gradually, broadly to the country in which you happen to live, and finally the whole of Earth. The idea here is to remind yourself that you're part of these whole with lots of other people. And in fact, this entire whole is embedded in nature itself, and that you should be trying your best to bring everything from those expanding circles, everyone from those expanding circles within your sphere of ethical concern. A related exercise, which usually follows immediately hierarchically circle, is the view from above. And the view from above consists in basically going beyond planet Earth and start visualizing the planet itself as, one planet as part of the solar system, and then our star is one star among many in the galaxy, and then our galaxy is one of many within a local cluster, and then the local cluster of galaxies is one of many within the cosmos. Again, this idea is to basically help you put things in perspective, and in some sense create some kind of detachment, not in the negative sense of the word, not in the sense that you don't care about other things because after all, nothing matters in the universe, but in the sense that nothing that seems so awfully important to you on a day-to-day basis is actually really that important on a broader scale. So those are the major elements. And then finally, I finish my morning meditation with picking one particular saying or particular quote from one of the Stoics, the classic Stoic authors. I have an increasing database. I keep reading and rereading and annotating Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and so on. And so I have a spreadsheet, which I actually make available publicly for other people to use, with a number of these. And then I pick one in the morning and I sort of read it over 2 or 3 times and sort of think about what it means. And then you're done. And that's the morning meditation. It sounds longer actually than it is. It really takes me about 10 or 15 minutes maybe. Although it can be longer depending on if you have more time to devote to it. Then you go about your day, and during the day, the main thing you're supposed to be doing is what Stoics call mindfulness. And by that, what they mean is remind yourself that almost every decision you make, including rather small ones, like what you eat for lunch, for instance, have an ethical dimension. And you should always be mindful of that ethical dimension. A lot of Stoics were vegetarian, incidentally. And at any rate, we're all concerned. The idea was always to be concerned with the ethical implications of what you're doing. And I find something that's actually remarkably difficult to do initially, because a lot of the decisions that we make are you just don't think about it. You go to the bank and you don't think that, oh my gosh, I'm going to this bank which is actually a conglomerate, an international conglomerate which has done horrible things to sort of the world economy. Should I really give my business to them? And once you start thinking about that way, all of a sudden you see just how many of your daily decisions do have consequences. Now, the idea is not to obsess about it and to necessarily radically change your life, but by being cognizant, perhaps you can start making adjustments and changes. For instance, I just mentioned banks. As a result of this, I changed my banking practices and I moved my money to a local credit union because they have better financial practices. And labor practices especially. So you do that throughout the day. Of course, this becomes particularly important when you interact with other people, colleagues, friends, family, whatever it is, or even strangers. And then finally, the last thing I do is at the end of the day, you do another meditation, but the evening meditation is kind of almost the reverse to some extent of some parts of the early morning meditation, which is you go over your day and you focus on sort of the crucial episodes that might have tested your resolve to live an ethical life. And you ask yourself 3 questions. These are questions you find very clearly spelled out in Seneca, but also in Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. And the questions are, well, what did I do right? So I encourage you to pat yourself on the back for the stuff that you did right. It's good. You did that right. That's a good thing. Then you ask yourself, of course, what you do wrong. And you're not supposed to, flagellate yourself, but you simply say, okay, well, that was a learning experience. Clearly that was wrong. Now I reflect on this, that was not the best way to react to whatever the situation was. So let's keep it in mind for the next time that a similar situation arises. And then thirdly, you ask yourself, what could I have done that I didn't do? And the insight there being that a lot of the times we don't do bad things. We just don't do the right thing. Sort of by inertia, or because we think of it too late, or whatever the situation is, or because we don't have the courage to act appropriately in a particular circumstance. So you make a mental note of that as well. And the idea is, it helps actually if you keep a diary of this. I keep a personal philosophical diary of these things, and occasionally go back and read entries from days or months earlier and say, oh, okay, that happened before, or, that didn't happen again, that sort of stuff. And then finally, you're supposed to let all of this go and go to bed with a, relaxed, rested mind, knowing that you've done your best and then you're going to do even better, hopefully the following day. So that's the general idea.
Excellent. And it's interesting that, and I suspect many of the listeners will find some great familiarity with what you've just described, that there's a formal kind of contemplative practice that you do in the morning and in the evening. Mm-hmm. There's the setting of an intention for how we're going to meet various situations and just our overall tone of the day, and maybe do a bit of a resetting on, we may have woken up on the wrong side of the bed. And let's reframe that a little bit. And in particular, the circle meditation, starting with oneself and then one's immediate family and then one's close to you, and expanding that to encompass the world and eventually all beings everywhere. Many Buddhists will be recognizing this as a loving kindness meditation. Right. And this is helping us to not really remove the importance of ourself, that we don't matter, but rather to see irrelevance of everyone else and our dependent interconnections between each other. And I don't mean that in a supernatural way. Right. I mean that what we do and what we put in the world has consequences for good and ill. And then during the day, you have your informal practices of just noticing. And this in particular is where mindfulness comes in, that if we don't even realize we are speaking with unnecessary aggression, or where we might bring in a little more openness and a little more curiosity rather than being quite as judgmental as we may reflexively be, if we can respond more than react, that's what we're doing throughout the day as part of how we're engaging with life in this practice.
That's right. I'm glad that you mentioned not being judgmental as a goal, right? That's a major goal of Stoicism as well. And in fact, the Stoics have developed, again, as a philosophy, as I said, it was very much sort of practically oriented. And so what Epictetus in particular did was to develop a series of, I was about to call them mantra, but they're not. But they're basically sort of almost, think of it as stock phrases, really, that you use with yourself to remind yourself, essentially, sort of shorthands for certain practices, right? For instance, when you're very tempted to make a rude comment about somebody, or essentially pass a judgment about somebody, or what somebody said or did, instead of doing that, Epictetus says, stop and say to this was Marcus Aurelius, stop and repeat to yourself, well, so it seemed to him, which is a nice way of saying, look, I still think he was wrong in doing this, but, he was doing it probably, I have to give him the benefit of the doubt. That person was acting because it seemed the right thing for him to do. And if it did the wrong thing, it might have been out of ignorance or out of, lack of understanding rather than out of, sheer evil. And we have
an innocent ignorance rather than an intentional aggressive ignorance.
Correct. And we have this idea of sort of demonizing, people that disagree with us. And, and that was definitely something that the Stoics very, very consciously, so reminding themselves are not doing. An important way of thinking about Stoicism, or an important point of Stoicism, was the difference between our emotions and the assent that we give to our emotions. So one of the very common misconceptions about Stoicism is that Stoicism is about suppressing emotions. Sort of the Star Trek character Spock.
Yep, I was going to bring up Spock. Good, glad you did it.
As it turns out, in fact, Gene Roddenberry designed Spock after Stoicism, very consciously, except that he didn't have a particularly good understanding of Stoicism, and so he kind of botched the job. And I'm telling you this, by the way, as somebody who absolutely loves both Star Trek and Spock in particular. But Spock is not a good example of a Stoic, precisely because he tries to sort of
deny emotions that are plainly there.
Correct. The idea instead is that, we all have emotional responses. And it's natural for human beings to feel things like fear or disgust or, or have moral, repulsion towards certain things and so on and so forth. And those are all natural, and there's no point in fighting them because these are, in fact, natural emotions. What there is a point in doing, however, is to sort of step back and decide whether you want to give assent, to use Stoic terminology, or not to that emotion. So let's say that I'm afraid of a particular situation. I have to train myself to recognize the fear and the object of that fear, and then think about it and say, okay, well, do I really have reasons to be afraid of this thing? In other words, to question my own judgment on things. And it may turn out that, well, yeah, there's very good reasons to be afraid of that because, that's a poisonous snake or something. In which case, it's a good idea to sort of be afraid of it and run away. But there's a lot of other things, especially in interactions with other fellow human beings, that we may react emotionally to sort of instinctively. And yet when we stop and reflect on it, we say, well, actually, there was no reason for me to give an assent to that emotion. Very often, the Stoic advice is to actually sit on your emotion for a while. So if you see a strong emotion coming and you don't feel like that's the right time to sort of reflect and meditate on it, just literally take a walk. If it says, just get out, get a walk, take a walk. And then when you feel more calm, think about over the situation again and see how to best handle it. And I think it's generally speaking, that's pretty good advice. I mean, regardless of sort of what one thinks of the general philosophy, it's not a bad way to go about doing things.
No, I think it's a terrific way, and that's part of what the practice is, either in Stoicism or in Buddhist practice or whatever we want to call it. The idea is we notice what's happening with us. That can be difficult. We sometimes notice it after we suddenly come to awareness and there are a bunch of bodies around us. We don't know what we did. Noticing it before that. And it's not, and I'm very glad you brought this up, it's not denying our emotions. It's not suppressing them. And in fact, in mindfulness practices, the idea is to lean into them, to be aware of them, because the tension of denying them or trying to suppress them or avoid them doesn't help the situation, because that's not reality. The reality is that they're there, and it's how we can still nonetheless make a decision, that we can take that pause. And I think creatively in the moment, because it's going to be different moment by moment what happens, think about, what might I do differently? What are the results that I want out of this, and what's the best way to do that? And it's not always easy to do because we are emotional creatures, and we do struggle with that.
And one of the things that I find interesting and helpful, both in Stoicism in particular and also in virtue ethics in general, as I mentioned earlier, Stoicism is one of a number of schools in virtue ethics among the ancient Greek and Romans. All of the virtue ethical schools had in common this idea that virtue is, at least in part, a matter of exercise, of practice. And so, we're not necessarily naturally virtuous people. We're not necessarily do the right thing, especially, when you're a kid, for instance. You tend to be much more egotistical than you probably ought to be. But the idea is that our moral improvement doesn't happen only during our childhood and only as a result of influences by, teachers and parents. It can and should continue throughout our lives. And it is self-sustained. It's internal. It's really very much like going to the gym. Yeah, the first time it hurts, the second time it hurts, the third time it hurts, and you don't necessarily want to do it. But the more you do it, not only the less it hurts, the more it becomes natural, the more benefit you gain out of it. And in fact, at some point, it becomes so natural that you really want to do it. You really want to go about it, and it becomes a second nature. You can see there the very close connection with cognitive behavioral therapy. I mean, cognitive behavioral therapy works exactly in that way. It's supposed to essentially condition people slowly to alter their behavior, to redirect their behaviors. You first analyze your behavior and what is wrong with it, and then you reconceptualize your behavior through small steps. And then the idea is that eventually, little by little, this will become easier and easier, less and less painful, and then finally you get out of whatever the problem is. And this is actually demonstrated to be useful in specific cases of fears, for instance, of certain objects or situations that can be treated by cognitive behavioral therapy, or even certain cases of depression. I mean, depression, of course, is a complex issue, some of which is not necessarily just behavioral, but it has to do with the chemistry of the brain. But nonetheless, there are certain kinds of depression that actually can be significantly helped by cognitive behavioral therapy, precisely working through essentially Stoic principles.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the way in which mindfulness interventions approach this very same thing is in that same way. And mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, works exactly as you described, and that this is very much a noticing practice that's a little bit at a time. You don't sit once and suddenly you're great and everything's fine. I wish I could do 5 push-ups and then I never have to again. And it's perfect. A metaphor I used, program I was teaching just this week, was someone asked, what's the minimum I can do? And there was the bargaining. What do I don't really want to do this. Totally get that. I know it's an expenditure of some effort. but what's the minimum I can do? And it's like, I want to trim down and be in great physical health. What's the minimum amount I can do at the gym? Like, well, you'll get out of it what you put into it. And if here in this one session we're handing you a violin, we're giving you the bow, we're showing you what a couple of notes are on a page. But in order for you to do music, you need to play this, you need to practice it. And not just doing scales on your own once a week with us for half an hour, but also on your own to get to a point where this does become an integrated part of your life.
Which, of course, is one of the reasons, I suppose, that, Stoic practice, and I assume Buddhist practice, doesn't, it's not necessarily everybody's cup of tea. It does require a certain kind of commitment, first of all. It also may resonate better with some people and not with others. I'm certainly not an apologist for Stoicism, as I don't wish it to become a universal. But I do think that it is a type of practice that does resonate with a number of people, especially people who are concerned about the ethical dimension, who are perhaps coming especially out of a Western intellectual tradition and are interested in philosophy already, or they're interested in the connection between philosophy, logic, and science. I mean, the Stoics were very much, for instance, into this idea that philosophy for them was a sort of a three-pronged activity. The most important part was ethics, was the practical part. But they seriously thought that you couldn't really practice good ethics, you couldn't formulate a good understanding of the virtuous life unless you also had together the other two pillars, which they referred to as, respectively, the physics and the logic. And what they meant by those two terms, however, it was much broader than what we mean today. Physics, for the Stoics, was everything that we today include under natural sciences, social sciences, and metaphysics. So basically, it's the best understanding of the world as it is that we can come up with. And the logic, what they called logic, included logic, the study of human reasoning, but it also included rhetoric, how to talk to other people in an effective way, how to communicate to people, because they thought that an ethical philosophy is very much intrinsically a social philosophy. So you really need to interact with other people. Ethics means interacting with other people. And it also included, their logic also included an what we today would call epistemology, a theory of knowledge. How do you know things? How do you actually know that this is a way to go and not that other way to know? So you have to be able to defend why you think that this is a good practice or this is a good approach. So in that sense, Stoicism was essentially a complete philosophy. Now, of course, 15 or more centuries later, we don't buy into the same metaphysical or physical or even logical notions necessarily that the Stoics did, although a surprising number of them is actually still relevant today. But the Stoics themselves, and this is one of the things that has actually attracted me to their approach, the Stoics themselves were very clear that they were open to very much to changing their positions on all sorts of specific issues, because, Seneca reminds us, for instance, that, we're not the last generation and the most knowledgeable generation. There's lots of stuff that we don't know, and future generations will know better, and a rational person will update their beliefs accordingly. And not only that, but even at the height of its power during the Roman Empire, Stoicism was very much in constant dialogue with other schools, especially the Cynics and the Skeptics. Of course, those two terms at the time were, again, broader and didn't mean what they mean today. The Cynics were not just a bunch of people who said, no, no, no. But the Cynics and the Skeptics had a different theory of knowledge, and they pushed the Stoics, and you can actually track through the writings of the Stoics from the early times to later Roman Empire. They were responding and they were changing their positions because they realized that some of those criticisms were in fact, correct or on target, and say, okay, fine, then let's take that on board. That's very much something that I appreciate about a intrinsically dynamic philosophy, and a philosophy that right up front tells you, look, here's what we think we know at the moment, but hey, we could be wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting that it shares that with the scientific method, that the part of this is challenging what we understand. How do we know that? And I think you're right. It describes the maturity of both the participants involved in the philosophy and maybe the philosophy itself, that it's flexible, it's extensible, it can change based on new information, and that leads to this interesting connection between ethics and how we relate. And you brought up the skeptic community. You and I are both involved with that, and there have been some challenges in the past few years with how some folks in the community will relate both to others outside of the community, folks who are very religious, or even internally we've had some challenges there. And so I'm wondering if you could talk for a few moments about ethics. I mean, we use the term a lot here without us really describing. What we're not talking about is a superimposed dogma externally. We're talking about something that arises naturally from relationship. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. When we think about ethics and morality, or let's say moral philosophy more specifically, the modern conception of ethics is very different from the ancient Greeks' conception. And I think, in my mind, the ancient Greeks actually got it right, or closer to what it's going to be useful for us. So in modern parlance, even among professional moral philosophers, ethics, morality has to do with doing the right thing. We're figuring out what is the right thing to do, and obviously, conversely, what are the wrong things to do. So that's the fundamental question of ethics in modern times. This is definitely ever since at least Kant, and then also John Stuart Mill. Those are the founding fathers of respectively modern deontology, modern duty-based ethics, and utilitarianism, or as it's called these days, sort of consequentialism. These are the two major approaches to moral philosophy that we have today. Now, if you talk to Aristotle, however, or to Zeno, or to Seneca, they would have been very puzzled if you put the thing that way. They say, well, that's not what ethics is about. Ethics is about the good life. It's about allowing you to decide what is the best life you can live, the happy life. And by happy, that didn't mean, the sort of hedonic, superficial, oh, I feel happy.
Smiley faces kind.
Right. That sort of stuff. What they meant was a virtuous life, a moral life. So, the idea was that depends on your character. That what makes you happy is the development of a good character, which includes, of course, a development of very meaningful, deep relationships with other fellow human beings. For Aristotle, family and friends were crucial. You were not a full-fledged human being unless you have meaningful friendships with other people. You relate to other people in a meaningful social way. So ethics, in the sense in which we've been talking about it throughout the last few minutes, really means the study of how to live a good life, which in turn means the study of how to develop a good moral character. Now, what about what's the right thing to do? Well, according to the ancient Greek Romans, that is a byproduct of having a good character. So if you develop constantly, if you keep going to the gym, let's say, to use our analogy from earlier on, right? Of course you're going to develop large muscles and a good aerobic capacity and all that sort of stuff, right? But that's not the point. The point is to develop a general, healthy body and mind and relationship.
Right. It's what comes out of the exercise, not the exercise itself.
Exactly. Now, once you're starting doing that, then you can answer specific questions such as, well, can I lift, 50 pounds or 60 pounds or 70 pounds? Well, that depends on whether you have actually been exercising the right way. And similarly, for ethics conceived in the way in which the Stoics and others conceived it, the question of, what is the right thing to do is a byproduct in some sense, is an outcome, is a result of the fact that you have a good moral character. If you do have a good moral character, then you will, in fact, be able to make the best determination, which, of course, is going to be fallible, because we're all fallible human beings. First of all, none of us is perfect morally, but even if we were perfect morally, we still would have a limited access to information about possible consequences of actions and so on and so forth. So, the Stoics were very much aware of the limits of human cognition and the human possibilities in general, but nonetheless, in the same way in which going to the gym regularly is the best way to prepare to live a healthy physical life, going to the sort of moral gym, basically, and working on your character every day is the best way to prepare you for a good ethical life, which for them meant a good life, period.
It's how do we work out that ethic muscle, that mindfulness muscle?
Yes, exactly.
So, talking just a little bit about your meditations and what you've been doing with Stoicism, what has that experience been like for you? How has that changed things in your day?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I never actually done something like that. A few times in my life, I actually kind of looked into Buddhism, and I even practiced briefly simple types of meditation. But it's certainly, it just, we were saying earlier, not everything is everybody's cup of tea. And it was clear that it was not resonating with me. And so I was like, okay, fine. I tried it. And for a long time, I became more and more cognizant of the fact that I really needed a little bit more grounding and a little more reflection about what my life was and where I was going with it and all that. I've always been a particular, a reflective kind of guy. I mean, it's not like I've lived a life without any thinking about what I was doing. But I felt like I needed more than that. And so when I decided finally to start practicing Stoicism, I said, well, let's give it a try and see how that actually changes things in practice for me, on an everyday basis. And so I initially gave it a commitment of a month. And then I sort of extended that commitment, and I currently keep going with it. And it has changed in the sense that, first of all, those routines that I described earlier, the early meditation, the evening meditation, and so on, kind of help grounding my day. It's sort of, they become sort of points of reference for every day. I know that I'm beginning the day in that particular way, and I look forward to it because it makes me feel like I have a better understanding of what's going on in my life and why I'm doing certain things and how I am doing certain things. So that has been the first positive outcome. The other one is clearly my companion and several of my friends tell me that they can see a significant improvement in my way of dealing with people. It's not like in the past I was yelling every few minutes or something like that, or, losing my temper every 5 minutes. But they have noticed a more reflective and especially sort of what I would call the word that was coming up to mind was actually ecumenical approach to things, meaning that I'm much more willing to see other people's points of view, even when they definitely do clash with my own, and even though when I think I have good reasons to reject those points of view. So you mentioned, for instance, the issue that the skeptic movement and the atheist movement have been having recently on how to deal not only with the inside, with different currents within the movement, but also with, say, religious people. One of the things that I like about Stoicism, it's intrinsically an ecumenical philosophy, meaning that there are certain basic metaphysical notions within Stoicism that can be equally well interpreted in a secular way and in a religious way, although within limits, and work fine. So let me give you an example. A crucial concept within Stoicism is the idea of the logos. The logos is, you can interpret it as literally the word that started the world. So, that's the way Christians interpret it. And as I said, that interpretation is actually not entirely independent of the interactions between Stoicism and Christianity. But you can also interpret it simply as a statement of a fact that the universe is comprehensible rationally, that it is organized along rational, sort of logical lines, even though there was nobody necessarily organizing it that way. It did come out that way. The laws of nature are organized that way. And that's what makes, of course, science possible to begin with. If there were no rational structure to the universe, you wouldn't have science.
Yeah, things do not happen with no cause whatsoever.
Exactly. And so I can take the concept of logos and talk to my atheist friends or even to my agnostic friends and say, okay, so we can both relate to this thing and we don't need to go any further. But I can also talk to some of my religious friends, as long as they're not completely fundamentally 6,000 day earth kind of thing, because and it's a whole different issue. Then we got different kind of issues. But if we're talking about a sort of mainstream religious person, even not only a deist, for a deist is particularly easy to get their mind wrapped around something like the logos, but even a theist, as long as that theist doesn't, as I said, push the boundaries too far to the point of, the God that answers each and every prayer and so on and so forth. There is a lot of room there for people to reasonably disagree and maintain respect of each other because they can agree on some of the foundational practices and ethical aspects. I really don't think that a lot of what I think is ethical and a lot of what I think makes for a good character, practicing the virtues of courage, equanimity, self-control, and sort of practical wisdom. I don't think you're going to find that many religious people who are going to say, oh, no, I don't go for that sort of stuff. Of course they do. And, I think actually that's something that we can share with a lot of other both philosophical and religious traditions. And to me, that's one of the things that makes the whole enterprise particularly attractive. And it has made me more open to the idea that, oh, okay, I can talk to this person. I know we disagree on foundational metaphysics, but so what? as long as we relate to each other as human beings, and in a meaningful way, and we can share a lot of other things, especially in terms of sort of practical ethics, then everything is fine. Then we have our metaphysical disagreements over a beer, and it's fine. Then we go home.
Yeah, and I think we have a lot of that in a secular approach to Buddhist practice. And for many of us, it's more about the practice than the ism side of it.
Exactly.
As an example we would have is karma, that those of us who are on the more scientific materialist side of things will look at cause and effect. And not just on a physics level of if I let this pencil go, it will drop. Of course, there's that. No one will disagree with that. But in terms of, well, yes, even after someone's gone, there are effects in the world. Abraham Lincoln is still having effects in the world. He's gone. We don't have to mean that in a supernatural sense. And we can have this conversation with one of our fellows who are more traditional in their practice, and they view karma as something that does carry on from one life to the next in a more supernatural way, but we can still have this grounded understanding that, and I'm glad the way you put this was spot on, we as human beings do experience this here in this world, and that's a point of collaborative agreement for us that's a rich and wonderful place for us to begin our exploration of ideas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that actually has bothered me increasingly about recent developments in the atheist movement in particular, and I'm talking about the new atheists. I can see why people feel like, yes, now we can finally openly talk about atheism and we can be clear about what we believe and all that. That's fine. Although I quite honestly think that it's an exaggeration to say that was made possible by the new atheists. I mean, there's Western societies have had open discussions about atheism since at least the beginning of the 20th century. So it's like, come on. It's not like you guys invented this thing. But sure, I
figure the ego's involved. It's those guys with two initial first names that were, yeah.
So, but I'm fine, granting that, sure, that certainly has helped the discussion, bringing the general discussion about religious belief and atheism to the more open public attention. Yes, but at the same time, a lot of that conversation, it appears to be focused on the points of divergence. It appears to be focused on, on why you're wrong, and not only you're wrong, but you're stupid because you're wrong. That sort of. It's like, no, that's not going to help. In fact, that's going to be doing exactly what the religious fundamentalists are doing on the other side. And I know that the new atheists don't like to be compared to religious fundamentalists, and in some sense, that comparison is in fact not fair, because there are differences in sort of intellectual positions, in social practice, and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, the confrontational attitude, it's not, I think, ultimately a winning proposition. I think we should live in a world, the world is multicultural. It's always going to be multicultural. People are always going to be having different opinions about metaphysics, let's say, than other people. But if we can agree on how to actually still conduct our life with respect to each other and building a better society, then frankly, those metaphysical positions are really not that important.
Right. Yeah, they lose their power when we have those kinds of engagements.
They are interesting as sort of intellectual exercises, and I'm certainly not about to say that I don't believe that certain things are more likely to be true than not, and so on and so forth. And if we want to have a discussion about that, we can definitely have a discussion about that. I have my reasons and my arguments. But I ultimately don't think that those are that important. They're not that crucial. And you can see that in your everyday life if you happen to have friends that are not just atheists. I have friends who are not atheists. They're perfectly nice people with whom I interact lots of the time, very nice. And then occasionally, if we want to discuss religion, sure, we're going to discuss religion. But we do it from a point of view of reciprocal respect, because that discussion comes on top of a much deeper web of social interactions that we share and we build.
Right. And in fact, I prefer the engagement with some of those individuals because of that attitude. And it's not that I agree with their beliefs. I don't. And they understand that, and they don't agree with mine. That's okay. But the idea, and frankly what I consider the excuse that some of the folks in our atheist communities have used, that, well, by being so very aggressive, I've managed to get some people pissed off enough that they check on it and then they realize they're wrong and they change their minds. Although that may be true, not disputing that at all, it's also a bit of a file drawer effect of you're also ignoring the 100 other people that you just made more firmly entrenched in their views, who will no longer listen to anyone at all.
Right.
And you've closed a mind.
And frankly, if we're talking about, evidence-based statements, which of course the atheists and skeptics are big on, quite frankly, there is a lot of evidence from basic psychology that if you insult other people, they're not going to change their mind. Occasionally you might shock somebody out of their beliefs that way, but that doesn't seem to be, empirically speaking, that doesn't seem to be the best way to go about it. And I would add that ethically speaking is not a good way to go about it. Treating other people is in a nasty way. It's not part of the good, positive virtues and character that I think Stoicism or Buddhism or other traditions are trying to build.
Well, even just adult social human beings should engage.
Yes, there's that.
More wagging, less barking. So I think what I'd like to do is kind of wrap up by going into some of the things you're working on now. I want to put a tack in our discussion of why skepticism is important with supernatural assertions for a different conversation, and really give you a chance to talk a little bit about what you're working on now that you mentioned early on before we got started with the recording.
Well, one of the things I'm doing now is almost a year ago, I started a online magazine called Scientia Salon. Scientia, which is spelled Scientia. It's the Latin word for knowledge broadly construed. And so it includes not just science, but also philosophy, mathematics, logic, and sort of even the historical and social sciences. So anything that can reasonably count as knowledge is under the broad umbrella of Scientia. And of course, a salon is a place from the Enlightenment where people get around and to openly discuss certain subjects. Now, the point of Scientia Salon is to offer a platform for academics who are interested in talking to the general public, but they don't have the time or the energy to set up their own blogs or their own social networks, and that sort of stuff. They only want to do this once in a while, occasionally. And I think that there is a duty, an intellectual duty by academics to do so, because I do think that the academy needs to be interacting more and more with the general public, with society at large. Academics can provide lots of interesting food for thought to lots of other people if only they started writing or interacting more often, instead of just the usual suspects, because we do have, of course, highly visible intellectuals, people like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Richard Dawkins and so on. But there's very few of those, comparatively very few of those compared to the number of people working in the academy. Not only that, but they tend to come from a very small subset of disciplines, typically physics or biology. Scientia Salon is open to pretty much anybody who is an academic broadly construed, including graduate students. Actually, I published some marvelous pieces by graduate students and faculty at different levels of their career. And then these are long reads. These are typically 2,000, 3,000, or sometimes even more words. And they're supposed to be about either the specific topic or the general area of expertise of that particular academic. And they're written in an accessible fashion for the general public. And then I invite readers for 5 days. There's a time limit, actually. 5 days to submit comments. I encourage people to submit extended commentary to get a very good, constructive, and deep discussion going. And it's working remarkably well. My colleagues are really enjoying this. Those 5 days after the publication of their piece, they really come to the site and answer a number of questions and get into dialogue with a number of readers. The level of the discussion is very polite and constructive, but it's also fairly sophisticated for a sort of broad audience like this. And I'm devoting now a significant amount of this time to both writing myself for Scientia Salon, of course, setting the example, but also editing submissions from other people. Next week, for instance, we're going to have 3 essays on the general topic of free will, which is one of those topics at the borderline, in my mind, between science and philosophy. There is both metaphysics and philosophy of mind that go into it, but there is also, of course, neurobiology and straight physics that enters into it. And so I have 3 different essays with 3 very different takes on the problem of free will, and I'm sure it's going to generate a large amount of interest and discussion. So that's a major project that I'm doing. The other thing that I'm working on, actually it's essentially done at this point, is a new collection of essays by myself and a number of others, which is going to be published by the University of Chicago Press, hopefully sometime by the end of this year or early next year. And the collection is on the general issue of scientism. So scientism is this idea that there are certain positions or certain statements or certain claims that are made in the name of science, even though they're actually either not supported by the science or they are about things where the science really tells us very little. So, for instance, the most obvious one, I think, in my mind, although there's disagreement on this, but the most obvious one is that science can settle moral questions.
Right. That's a difficult one.
Exactly. I mean, I'm sure that's a whole different show about it. My take on that particular one is that, of course, factual information, including scientific information, I do not equate facts with science. Because science to me means something much more specific.
There's a process around that. It's not just the raw data.
Exactly. But clearly facts, factual knowledge is relevant to a number of ethical questions and a number of ethical decisions. But as philosophers would say, the facts underdetermine the ethical positions, meaning that the same set of facts is compatible with more than one ethical position, in which case you need to bring in the philosophers who, especially the moral philosophers who have thought about this for a long time and say, okay, well, given these facts, what are the arguments in favor or against this particular position or that particular position? So this is a collection on scientism where a number of philosophers and scientists have contributed, and there's a number of positions, a spectrum of positions on scientism. There are some people who openly defend the practice of scientism, and I actually think it's a good thing. On the one hand, at the opposite extreme, there are people who think it's very pernicious, and then there are people in the middle, like myself, who say, well, let's talk about individual cases and see what happens. In some cases, the scientific claim is probably unfounded or misguided. In other cases, actually making a good point, and it's going to be helpful for discussion.
It's interesting. I've rarely heard the term scientism used in anything but a pejorative fashion. So I'm kind of curious about the book when it comes out.
Right. Yeah. There are some people, a number of scientists and a small number of philosophers now who have actually taken it as a badge of honor. And I think that's a whole interesting sort of sociological development in and of itself.
Yeah, it is. And I love the new effort. I'll be linking to this along with a few other spots on the episode page. The salon is the thing that I am particularly intrigued by. That is because that's what this podcast and my others and your podcast are about, is how do we bring to the general public, in particular the sciences, which is typically a paper comes out and scientists speak amongst themselves and the general public has no information, or what they do get is from a sensationalized article that is irresponsible journalism that gets it wrong, maybe through an aggressive ignorance or an innocent ignorance. It's just not right. And so giving a voice to people doing research, to academia, to the general public is a wonderful effort. So thank you so much for putting that out there.
A pleasure. Hopefully it will work better and better.
Great. Our guest today has been Massimo Pigliucci. Massimo, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.